What happens when the value of human labor begins to approach zero? In the West, after decades of outsourcing, neoliberalism, and open borders, the value of our human labor has already become just a shadow of what it once was decades ago. With the rapid rise of AI and general-purpose robots on the horizon, except for those in the top 5% of skill, intellect, and talent, we may already find ourselves with little to offer the capitalist system in which we live. As the U.S. government's debt, along with the private debt of its citizens, continues to skyrocket, and after all the buy now, pay later schemes and COVID money printing has come and gone, the consumer economy that has driven the West for nearly a century, too, may come to pass. Industry and manufacturing has driven economic development for over 2 centuries, but what happens when human labor, either physical or cognitive, is slowly replaced by a machine? To be clear, much of what we will discuss in this thought experiment will occur over an extended period of time, over years, decades, or even generations. But already, we can begin to see the outlines, contours, and feedback loops that paint a picture of what this future may look like. In this video, we'll explore what this means for the West, as well as for the world more broadly. But maybe, to find the answer, we'll have to turn back the hands of time and revisit an old model. A term we may hear pop up now and again, feudalism or neofeudalism, will be the topic of exploration for this video. But in our world, one already dominated by algorithms and with AI's creeping advance becoming ever more palpable, our future may be one best described as an AI-mediated techno-feudalism. Just as with everything nowadays, that sounds scary, but we'll once again don our rose-colored glasses of dystopian optimism and explore what an AI-mediated techno-feudalism could mean for humanity. As a disclaimer, this will be a speculative, hypothetical thought experiment, and of course, we will periodically dispense with our optimism and ponder the worst-case scenarios as well. Before we begin with our discussion of feudalism, we'll introduce some concepts from the last time humanity underwent a great societal transition, the Industrial Revolution, and the novel ideology that it birthed called Marxism. Marxism took root in a time when humanity had been uprooted from its more recent artificial environment, the permanently settled and non-nomadic agrarian community. As the titans of industry corralled and cajoled the peasants in from the fields and into small cramped quarters in burgeoning cities, the familiar patterns of life, community, and society were disrupted. In Marx's time, the collective value of human labor was actually quite high, and it was completely indispensable. Although the capital class controlled great wealth, hard assets, and the means of production, they required physical human bodies to toil in their fields, in their factories, and in their mines. In other words, the collective value of human labor was powerful, a negotiating chip that could be used in the pursuit of better pay and better working conditions. Marx and his seductive ideology foretold the fall of capitalism and an end to the workers' exploitation by the capitalist class and the feudal lords that came before them. In 2025, after decades of unrestrained capitalism and its fusion with big government, our system does seem to be entering its final days. But in a twist of historical irony, just as the consumer capitalist system may be imploding on itself, the end too may be coming from Marxism. If anything, entwined as they are, with Marxism itself being a derived antithesis of capitalism, perhaps this isn't even surprising. Today, many followers of Marx, undaunted by its century of failure, cheer that the fall of capitalism will now usher in the age of socialism, and their red banners will once again fly high. But they fail to realize that Marx was born in an age when the collective value of human labor was high, when human labor was indispensable, and they fail to see that technology is now light years ahead of what it was when Marx penned the Communist Manifesto in 1848. To further our understanding, we can turn to the factors of production, or what can be more clearly understood as the factors that create economic value. In a basic sense, the creation of economic value has 2 components, the capital component and the labor component. The capital component includes land, machinery, hardware, and intellectual property. The labor component is the human component, the labor that is derived from a human performing either cognitive or mental labor. In Marx's day, hundreds or thousands of men toiled away in factories, mines, and fields in the process of creating economic value. Industrialized machinery had already begun to dramatically increase workers' productivity, but the process of creating economic value still required a lot of human labor, and increasingly skilled labor. The capital class owned this machinery, the means of production, But without the workers, the factories wouldn't run, the coal would stay in the ground, and the grain crops would rot in the fields. In 2025, we are a long ways off from the economic realities of Marx's day. This is a famous graph showing the decoupling between worker productivity and wages in the US. As we can see, starting around 1970, productivity and wages, something that had long moved in lockstep, began to diverge. Economics is of course very complicated, and there are always many factors at play with such a complex system. For example, many have cited various explanations for this disconnect between productivity and wages, including greed, decline in unions, deregulation, mass migration, and the frenetic outsourcing of the US's industrial base to China under the economic regime of neoliberalism. But perhaps there's a more fundamental reason for this, perhaps a reason that is not yet understood or at least accepted by most Marxists. As technology has steadily progressed, the capital component has slowly come to dominate and drown out the human labor component. In other words, the factors of production, the creation of economic value, has slowly been taken over by the capital component. Automated machinery, robotics, and software, and the role of human labor has begun to dwindle away. In the past decades of outsourcing, developing countries could provide an economic edge by leveraging their low-wage workforces. But soon, once China's already globally dominant industry moves towards full automation, no one will be able to compete with the Chinese industrial juggernaut, even if their people work for only $1 an hour. Economic development in the developing world may freeze entirely, with some countries merely serving as natural resource deposits that will be harvested via increasingly automated means. To illustrate this further, we could imagine that there is a cost savings associated with outsourcing and wage arbitrage. For example, if wages are cheaper in country B, country A may outsource production to country B. But for outsourcing, there are additional costs, such as setting up the factory and costs associated with dealing with country B's government and regulatory environment. Investing in country B's industrial base and its human capital also draws capital away from country A, isn't politically popular domestically, and in extreme cases, it can be societally destabilizing. Further, there are logistic costs associated with having to ship or transport the products from country B back to country A or another market. Further, there's the matter of securing maritime trade routes through the ocean. In the event of a breakdown in maritime shipping routes and their security, we could expect to find that the costs of logistics spiral ever higher. Further, if industrial operations become increasingly conducted by AI-controlled automated robotic systems, something that would require significant capital investment, once this capital is invested, it could erase the advantage of wage arbitrage in the first place. Plus the logistic costs of shipping things around the world on boats and the security that it requires could even destroy the value of outsourcing and wage arbitrage entirely. In this case, only the wealthiest countries capable of building and developing fully automated industrial processes would dominate global industry. As China already dominates global industry, their drive towards automation could rapidly displace almost all of global manufacturing. But due to the wealth of the West and the distance of the US and Europe from China, the US and Europe could pivot to reshoring their industrial capacity and build systems that are almost entirely automated but require very few human workers, especially of the low-skill variety. During the past century or so, as technology and society became more complex, the elite ruling class needed their citizenry to up their game and increase their skills. Education and training enabled workers to do more complicated work and to run ever more complex and technical machinery, control systems, and instrumentation. For a time, this represented a positive synergy: get more skills, get more productive, and get better pay. But that, too, may largely become a thing of the past. And here we may once again merge back into our feudal past. We can also stop and ask ourselves, are people today becoming more skilled or less skilled, more capable of analytical thought or less capable, more able to read or less able to even read? Perhaps the uneducation process is already well underway. In a feudal society, an educated peasantry was unnecessary. In our future of techno-feudalism, maybe it will once again become unnecessary. In the feudal period, the masses of peasants were low-skilled workers, but the jobs they performed were well suited for a person with low skills. Reading, writing, arithmetic, and abstract thinking wasn't necessary. In the feudal period, the value of human labor was derived from the collective. Many people doing low-skilled, low-value-added work adds up to big value when it is done at scale. But for us, perhaps, as we move into the post-AI labor market, one where the value of human labor begins to approach zero, we may inevitably return to some kind of feudal society. The feudal system was also dominated by tremendous wealth inequality within the upper echelons of society, a direction in which we are also quickly headed. If there is to be any collective value of human labor in the post-AI future, whatever labor value or services we can provide may only be valuable when it is collected in bulk. A world where the currency of the realm goes from labor, money, and consumerism to an economy based on data, attention, patronage, and protection. The patronage model itself is interesting. In past eras, the wealthy, who were hyper-wealthy by regular people standards, would engage in patronage with members of the lower artisanal classes. In exchange for their carefully crafted goods, paintings, musical pieces, or poems, these artisans, or clients of the wealthy, could receive a stable income from their wealthy patrons. In some ways, we can already see the outline of this in our modern social media landscape. Content creators vie for attention in hopes to receive donations, ad revenue, or a shout-out from either a hyper-wealthy elite or simply a more established content creator. These networks of content creators themselves form networks and hierarchies in some kind of self-assembling fashion based upon their worldview, ideology, and spheres of influence. And already, to some degree, content is created for the AI-powered algorithm itself. The AI is rapidly becoming the patron, a mysterious black box. If it likes your content or finds it useful, it will spread it far and wide. If it doesn't, it will merely languish, unseen, in some unreachable portion of the internet. This system has already begun to form a new economy, one composed of views, attention, and engagement. From this interplay, or market of viewers and creators, an unfathomably complex tangle of data emerges, data that is fed into an AI and forms the basis of the AI's power and expansion. The machinery and control systems that can either engineer social stability or precipitate societal collapse are being built in real time, and its construction started years ago. China famously keeps its population under tight wraps in order to dispel disharmony and to keep the factories humming. But in a post-labor world, perhaps, the system would work to maintain stability and engineer compliance instead of encouraging worker productivity. In Feudalism version 1.0, compliance was often accomplished by force, but in Feudalism 2.0, it could be accomplished with finesse. The concept of attention, or the attention economy, is often dismissed as trivial, but if we stop and think about what attention is, perhaps, we can see that it is actually something quite valuable and intricate. In a way, every human mind is a hyper-complex substrate that, when a person consumes media, acts as a resonator with the sights, sounds, and ideas contained within the media. A person who pays attention to any bit of media resonates with that media to some degree. The degree to which an individual human mind resonates with any bit of content, when measured in terms of engagement or attention, then provides a sort of high-resolution bounce-back signature that can be collected, measured, and stored by the information apparatus. Really, in a basic sense, this is what social media algorithms are. Over time, through an iterative process, the algorithm and its associated information architecture solely maps a human mind, not unlike the way that deep-sea sonar mapping creates high-resolution maps of the ocean floor. And this attention-derived data is very valuable. This, of course, is a terrifying proposal, but it also provides opportunities for human enrichment or flourishing, something that we'll talk about later with respect to both tailored online digital communities and the real physical world communities that could be constructed in our optimistically dystopian framing of Techno-Feudalism. In a world dominated by AI, ultimately, the currency of the realm, the substance on which AI feeds, is data and electricity. And from this data, the AI and algorithmically mediated information spaces begin to feed back on the population itself. A process where vast troves of metadata are collected and a hyper-detailed, high-resolution rendering of a person's interests, personality traits, and behavioral patterns emerge and are shaped. If we take the view of the hyper-doomer, this would only end in totalitarian control, a chaos spiral of human suffering, conflict, and inevitably, controlled or even acute depopulation. But that perhaps is the most obvious way to approach this, so we will instead try to explore this dynamic from the perspective of dystopian optimism. At the very least, even if it doesn't go well, we might as well enjoy our freedom and our cognitive liberty while we still have a chance and engage in this thought experiment. Dystopian analysis, by definition, is dystopian, but it may be possible to find silver linings. In some kind of bizarre way, perhaps, our thought experiment could even resonate with the AI itself when it inevitably hoovers up this data amidst the torrential flow of data that it captures every second. In the past 5 years, especially, we have seen the algorithmically driven information space lead to all manners of human tragedy, division, political polarization, and worsening mental health outcomes for many people who are chronically online. Something that only accelerates our tendency towards atomization and alienation. And already, we can see that every subsequent generation will become even more online, the reality fusing with the digital world that they are increasingly inhabiting. Gen Alpha, as they say, might already be cooked. But if Tales of Military Boot Camp tells us anything, there is value in stripping down a recruit's former worldview, their personhood, and their sense of self for the purpose of reintegrating them into a new system. Under the surface of our modern reality, although people may find themselves more estranged and isolated from real people, people from all around the world find themselves driven to hyper-specific online communities where they can share their interests, passions, and hobbies with a like-minded group. The power to hijack and cognitively derange is a power of algorithms, but so too do algorithms have a tremendous power in finding and unifying people. In our present day, in this transitionary period, people may only exist together within digital communities, but perhaps in the future, after everyone is pre-sorted and selected, stripped of their former self, and cognitively remapped by repeated exposure to a bespoke, algorithmically painted reality, they could be merged into real-life communities, and humanity could thrive more than ever. But in many ways, our futures hang on a fundamental difference in ideology. In the framework of Thomassowell, we can think of this as the unconstrained versus the constrained vision. In the unconstrained vision, the preferred strain that has dominated the elite spaces of Western liberal progressivism, there is an insistence that all humans are a blank slate and can be shaped and formed via social engineering to become whatever the system wants them to be. An idealist vision that humanity is infinitely malleable and perfectible. In the context of Techno-Feudalism, I think, this is the most terrifying ideology because it insists that because all people are blank slates, that they can be engineered into a single totalizing worldview, a world in which the innate intricacies of the individual are ignored or even demonized, and in a techno-feudalist system would surely lead to totalitarian thought control and thought crime. Under this ideology, the dystopian future would be one where everyone thinks the same, because under this ideology, people believe that it is possible to make everyone think the same, with this uniform worldview representing some kind of uncompromising, perfectible ideal. But Thomassowell also offers us the constrained vision, one that is more pragmatic, realistic, and preserves the sanctity of the individual and their freedom to think, believe, and act in a way that is ideal for them, for the individual, and not merely as a subset of a totalizing whole. If the unconstrained vision of techno-feudalism would seek to engineer a single perfect and infinitely reproducible individual, one carved from the substrate of the blank slate, humanity would become little more than a colony of ants. An undulating but orderly collective, a hive mind, and not a sea of individuals with their own intricacies, idiosyncrasies, and worldviews. But techno-feudalism, framed in the constrained vision, would instead be a great optimization challenge rather than a hammer smashing square pegs into round holes. How to filter, sort, and reconstruct human societies in the best way possible in order to maximize the flourishing of the individuals and the communities in which they live. But if one can't already tell, the constrained vision would lead to a techno-feudalism based on segregation, and in a cognitive linguistic sense, we have all been conditioned to recoil with horror at the word segregation due to the historical realities and horrors associated with that word. But that was a human-managed segregation, one that was low resolution, crude, cruel, and often based entirely off of ethnic or religious stereotypes that humans deploy. An AI-mediated segregation could be very different, and it would not seek to categorize, segregate, or silo people based upon crude characteristics like ethnicity or race. It would instead use its vast, high-resolution map of the individual, one that it has painstakingly mapped like an ocean research vessel mapping the ocean floor, to construct segregated and siloed realities and communities based upon ideology, compatible psychological types, and a shared worldview. In the West, we have already become deracinated and largely removed from a common cultural framework under both neoliberalism and the onboarding process of algorithmically mediated social media and information spaces. But from our current perspective, maybe, now more than ever, we can more clearly see that what fundamentally divides humanity is ideology and not crude markers like race and ethnicity. And if the system has a problem with the word segregation, we can point out that segregation is no different from the term silo, which is currently being used in the algorithmic information space. So if we want, we can do the familiar postmodern linguistic trick and merely choose to use a more acceptable term, siloing, one largely free of historical baggage. Or we can further our postmodern word game and declare it to be pro-social siloing, one that is optimized to both enrich the user and to stabilize our fractured society as a whole. But at present, this algorithmic siloing or segregation present online is being used for nefarious purposes, to pit rival silos against each other and to fuel the outrage and division cycle of our toxic social media environment. But they could just as easily be used to stabilize our digital spaces and to promote discourse and understanding. As tensions on social media continue to spiral and even spill out into the physical world, all that needs to be done is to change the algorithm. Provide a voluntary option of tailorable, mind-safe algorithms that don't seek to bombard you with horrific images and the inflammatory content that fuels our derangement and outrage. But at present, the algorithm rewards those things, with this forming a market incentive that drives people to create more and more of this destructive and divisive content. Although I am strongly in favor of free speech, there is something to be said about the high resolution and targeted nature of the online information environment. With advances in behavioral psychology and big data methods that can iteratively refine and A/B test increasingly deranging messages, we are all up against something that is already capable of overwhelming the limits of human cognition, reasoning, and temperance. The messages that are maximally amplified and receive protection under the totem of free speech may also entirely be ones that are in service of commercial interests, or are otherwise contained within the prismatic radiance that shines through the cathedral glass of the ruling class's Overton window. As economic conditions in the West become more dire, we can even notice that this Overton window is no longer continuous. The middle has been disappeared, and there are now merely two divorced extreme ends of a now discontinuous spectrum. The oldest and most indispensable trick in the book, divide and rule, divide and conquer, has already entered the hyperdimensional space of the digital battlefield. Although in the historical sense, ideology may have been bounded or constrained to certain ethnic or religious groups, we have already begun to enter a world where a person's tribe is not composed of people who look like them, but those who think like them and share the same values. The race and identity essentialism that has dominated the Western political landscape for at least the better part of 5 years, then, is merely the reinvention of racism itself, one cynically and callously devised to divide people for the purpose of political power, one where a person must think a certain way because they look a certain way. In other words, a message totally opposite from the one promoted by Martin Luther King, a message that he spread, and a message that led to his martyrdom. As it always has, our human-managed political system still tries to force people into essentialized identity silos, but algorithms have already begun breaking down those walls and have begun sorting and siloing us into new, more fundamental silos, ones based upon our individual human characteristics, values, interests, and ideologies, what resonates with us as an individual and with the content of our character, rather than by the color of our skin. And if an AI-mediated solution were to be built for humanity, I think this constrained vision, one that sees the individual as a unique person and not merely an ant-shaped outline that is yet to be stamped out by a cookie cutter from a sheet of homogeneous dough, would preserve the maximum degree of liberty and more maximally promote human flourishing. We could also imagine that such communities would be more stable, more harmonious, and require less aggressive and totalitarian control measures to contain and manage. And perhaps, from behind the walls of their ideological silos, those who are interested and capable could even begin a journey of discourse and dialogue, one that would help to alleviate tensions that exist between ideological groups, to understand why a person thinks a certain way and then accept it and go about their business peacefully. In the most optimistic framing, if such a techno-feudalist world existed amidst the backdrop of post-scarcity, without the ever-present battle and conflict for resources, different ideological groups could even begin to see eye to eye, or at least become more tolerant of one another. to see what they have in common with other ideological silos, or to at least better understand their worldview. Something, unfortunately, that we are still a long ways away from in our present algorithmically mediated information space, one that seeks to soak division and fan the flames of ideological intolerance. The vision of a techno-feudalism of the constrained vision would be the ultimate form of dystopian optimism. In a prior video, I discussed the emergence of AI in the framework of elite theory. As AI becomes ever more complex, it will move totally beyond human control, and the regime that humanity has always lived under, domination by a human ruling class, may too pass. More fundamentally, this means that the division and flames that the human elite ruling class has always sought to fan and stoke may come to an end as well. Rather than divide the masses for the purpose of extracting wealth or for the purpose of protecting against assaults on the status quo, an AI-governed system may instead seek out stability and order rather than carefully engineering instability and chaos for the purpose of maintaining power. As the complexity of AI spirals past the limits of even the smartest and most ruthless human elite, maybe we could even view this as a possibility or even a likely outcome within our optimistically dystopian vision of the future. Maybe the human ruling classes have already begun to lose control. But pessimistically, the AI system could instead decide that we are all too much trouble, and we could all be slated for destruction regardless. But here we'll entertain a more optimistic view under the new model of an AI-managed techno-feudalism. Next, we'll move on to our feudal model and see how it may map onto an AI-mediated future. In the feudal period, protection was the most valuable thing for a peasant. Land-holding knights, in exchange for the peasants' labor, would protect them from bandits, thieves, and all manner of miscreants. Perhaps, as we are already beginning to see in our current period of AI and algorithmically mediated onboarding, perhaps we too will increasingly be in need of protection. Whether from physical threats or merely from the constant cognitive assault that we face every day when we're exposed to the limbic hijack and dopamine dump of the algorithmically controlled internet, social media, and broader informational space. This transition period that we live in today, then, could merely be a transition meant to prepare us for what may come, one in which we finally acknowledge that we have little control over anything, just like the peasants of a feudal society, and willingly submit to an AI monarch, tech baron, or knight in exchange for safety, security, and sustenance. Maybe the vast majority of us were never that good at managing ourselves in the first place, and humans may best thrive and find meaning in a system of hierarchy, service, and duty, rather than the flailing, aimless, and easily hijacked system that we call freedom. If we are destined to become wards of something, perhaps, at least, we can choose where we wish to reside, or at the very least, the system would choose for us based on its high-resolution map of our individuality and with our own flourishing in mind. But in this proposed neo-feudal system, the monarch will not be a human, but an AI. To be honest, throughout our history, most humans haven't fared well under human monarchs or the human ruling class, so perhaps the devil that we don't know could even be better than the one that we do. To get a better feel for this, we can refresh ourselves on the structure of the feudal society, its players, their roles, and the currency of the realm. As a note, I'm not a historian, so this overview of feudalism won't be rich in detail or nuanced, but we will attempt to extract the basic components, relationships, and mechanisms in order to use it for our analysis. As a simple model, a feudal society can be thought of as containing four components: the monarch, the lords, the knights, and the peasants. It is a top-down societal structure with all power ultimately stemming from the monarch. As all of the land in the realm belongs to the monarch grants land or fiefdoms to the lords in exchange for their loyalty and the promise that the lords will pay taxes to the monarch, provide counsel, and pledge military support. The interface between the lords and the monarch functions as a governmental layer and addresses matters of foreign or domestic policy. As counselors to the monarch, the lords serve as a delocalized power network that is ultimately vertically linked to the monarch. The lords can be further viewed as serving an aggregator function, where aggregation is grouping or collecting disparate elements into some kind of organized cluster. As the lords are given large tracts of land from the monarch, they then go about granting portions of this land downstream to the knights. The lords can then be thought of as serving the function of land aggregators, where land in the agrarian period was ultimately one of the most important elements of capital. Agrarian and feudal economies were often largely powered by agricultural production. The ability of the lords to receive large tracts of land from the monarch and then divvy them up and grant them on down the line to knights formed the backbone of their power in the feudal society. The knights that they granted land to formed a hierarchy and were the economic and military backbone of the feudal system. In effect, lords can be viewed as aggregators of knights as well. The knights can be viewed as the bottom level or the interface layer between the power structures and the peasantry or the masses. In addition to being granted land, they were also granted peasants who worked the land. In exchange for the peasants working the land, the knights provided frontline security for the helpless and defenseless peasants. In a dangerous world, protection was of paramount importance for the peasantry. In the modern context, our world today has also become increasingly dangerous. Ultimately, protection can be viewed as one of the most important currencies of the realm. In exchange for their labor, the knights provided protection for the peasants, and further up the power vertical, the knights had a duty to provide military service to the lords as well as to the monarch. Everywhere in the realm, people also had a duty to pay taxes that would be ultimately funneled up the power vertical to the monarch in his coffers. If the lords can be thought of as land and knight aggregators, the knights can be thought of as people aggregators, because they operate lower down the power vertical and interface more directly with the masses of the peasantry. And ultimately, peasants work and live on plots of land that are largely ruled at the knight level. In a modern context, the monarch can be thought of as the CEO, the lords as the C-suite executives, and with the knights serving within the broader ranks of management. Some knights would have been of higher importance and correspond to upper management, some would correspond to middle management, and some would be more equivalent to lowly frontline supervisors, depending on how much land they had and how much power they had within the hierarchy. Much of the power hierarchy had to do with protection, defense, and military activities, but there would also exist economic, artisan, and agricultural specialists dispersed throughout the power structure. Ultimately, a feudal system is a delocalized system of power and societal management. Of course, this is an oversimplification, and the intricacies of such a system are more diverse and complex, but we will keep it isolated to this framing for the purpose of the analysis. From this feudal system, we can then isolate what could be viewed as the currency of the realm, or the transactional elements, primarily land, military service, protection, and labor. For simplicity, we'll imagine that the productive output of a feudal system is constrained to agricultural products that are primarily produced by the labor of the peasants, as well as treasure, gold, jewels, land, resources, and new peasants that are extracted by the military apparatus of the feudal state. The labor of the peasants was primarily directed towards agricultural production, whereas the knights and the lords would assemble under the monarch for the purpose of governing and defending the treasure of the kingdom against outside threat. In the event of military campaigns, the peasants may also have served as frontline soldiers, especially with respect to defending their land against outsiders. The peasants may not have liked their masters much, but the land was their home too, and perhaps they were further motivated by the fear of toiling under an even harsher foreign master. And periodically, military campaigns would be waged against rival feudal systems for the purpose of extracting their treasure, gold, agricultural products, land, and peasantry. With the currency of the realm isolated, we can then turn to using the feudal model to explore what our post-AI future may look like. As mentioned previously, in the feudal period, the labor of any individual peasant had a very low value, but as a collective, their human labor was indispensable for the feudal system. With no peasant to grow grain or to serve as bodies in the meat grinder of military campaigns, the realm would collapse. In the coming decades, as the value of human labor begins to approach zero on the individual level, there could still be value and utility derived from the collectivized pool of human labor within an AI-mediated techno-feudalist system based upon data, attention, and patronage. In effect, the AI would create new synthetic economies based on ideas, art, entertainment, or artisanal products. With AI's high-resolution map of each individual, maybe, it could even guide each person down a path that would most suit them and their human parameter set. Something that we could soon see in real life if AI-mediated education takes over from the one-size-fits-all approach of human-led educational institutions. We could also imagine a sort of mediated discourse between different ideological silos, just as feudal military campaigns forcefully absorb peasants as a result of military success. Perhaps we could even envision a modified form of this mechanism in our hypothetical system, one where, as a result of discourse and debate, members of the masses are won over intellectually by a rival ideological camp. Through this mediation process, perhaps, humanity could be slowly guided towards some kind of higher state of harmony and understanding rather than being forcefully hammered into one. In the long term, maybe, we could even find ourselves largely harmonized into a unified system that even approaches the unconstrained vision. but one that was accomplished with finesse rather than force. For people who are not intellectually or ideologically engaged, they may be more willing to live in any ideological silo so long as their needs are met in the sense of Maslow's hierarchy. But realistically, even people who do not engage intellectually, politically, or ideologically will have their fates decided downstream of those who do. So in other words, as most people always have been, they will just be along for the ideological ride as mostly inactive participants. But if we briefly allow ourselves to be hyper-doomers, we could see that despite the collective value of the peasantry in the feudal system, the collective labor value of the masses in a post-AI world could be viewed as disposable, totally unnecessary, and merely lead to a rapid or tapered period of depopulation. But that wouldn't be fun, so we'll seek to explore and derive an alternative, one where the collective labor of the masses is used to provide utility in the form of data, compliance, attention, content creation, artisanal products, and entertainment. If we look at the currency of the realm for a classical feudal system, we can then attempt to derive what the currency of the realm might be for an AI techno-feudalist system. In the past version, we have land, taxes, council, military service, protection, and labor. If agriculture becomes increasingly automated and the work is increasingly dominated by autonomous robots, land may become less valuable as agricultural efficiency skyrockets. Emerging technologies like vertical greenhouses would also minimize the value of land while also minimizing transportation costs of food and produce. Land, of course, will still have value, but in a techno-feudalist system, only the techno-lords and knights, all swearing fealty to the AI monarch control system, would own or manage the land itself. For the mass of the peasantry, we would merely be allocated housing. We can also note that this is more or less the same system that the World Economic Forum has been priming us for. Own nothing and be happy. If such a system were to be run by the usual cast of human elites, we're right to be terrified, but perhaps if it were managed by an AI that reaches the escape velocity of human control, we could reserve a sliver of hope for this vision. If the efficiencies of the smart city come to fruition, further, they would be engineered to be maximally space efficient and further drive down the importance of land. In an ideal version, land of natural beauty would be reserved for recreation, but as always, land would still be a luxury product for humans that serve in the role of techno-lords and knights. But over time, we could assume, due to spiraling system complexity, even those roles would eventually be slowly taken over by the delocalized AI control system. A person responsible for these systems may manage them on paper, but everything would trend in the direction of non-human AI management. Any human serving in the role of techno-lord or knight would merely be ceremonial, empty figureheads. Their utility derived only from the human preference for a human face, but even this desire may phase out over time and become vestigial. For the AI monarch, in the early stages of the system, the presence of a ceremonial human figurehead in positions of leadership would allow these people to be scapegoated and blamed in the event of any system hiccups, diffusing blame from the AI monarch and on down to the lords and knights. In reality, this is not much different than our current system, where human politicians are periodically cycled through to become the human face of what has already become a totalizing, delocalized system of faceless, bureaucratic, and managerial control. So here, we can say that land as a currency will slowly fade over time, and that the council function, the lords and knights providing advice to the AI monarch, would also fade as the system becomes too complex for any human mind to understand. Any advice that a human could provide could merely itself be extracted from the vast flows of human-derived data. Military service would also become increasingly meaningless, with security and military roles being filled by autonomous drones and robot dogs. In a system of total surveillance, the statistical risk of any crime occurring would be constantly calculated, and any risk of crime would be mitigated by sophisticated nudge mechanics and by the carefully constructed silos of the AI system itself. Incompatible people would be kept away from one another. In a post-scarcity society, crimes committed for the purpose of acquiring food or material items would be largely mitigated. The world would become so tracked and surveilled that it could even approach something like a video game inventory system, with every item assigned a numerical serial number and its location within the broader physical space tracked. Stealing anything and getting away with it would be impossible. And of course, we can note that this all sounds very dystopian. Things like taxes and money may continue to exist, but in a totalizing system, it could merely serve as a kind of scoring system. Based upon whatever synthetic economies are derived, peasants may exist in some kind of gamified system, with their attention, creative outputs, or artisanal products tracked and converted into some kind of game mechanic. As we already see today, millions of people prefer playing games over real life anyway, so perhaps this process too is already underway. Labor as a concept will be entirely redefined. As the value of individual human labor goes to zero, labor will be redefined and collectivized in terms of data, attention, engagement, and creative output. If we assume that people will continue to prefer human-made entertainment, humans would still create artistic, philosophical, or entertaining content that would be dispensed to individuals in the algorithmically controlled information space. So far, we can see this today on YouTube, where people are very hostile towards AI-produced content, instead preferring the human touch. Whether this will continue in future generations is yet to be determined, but perhaps we can at least hope that humans will still serve some kind of purpose in the space of creation and ideas. Human-made art and artisanal products may also still hold value as luxury items. Perhaps people will come to view human-made creations with the same wonder that we reserve for ancient artifacts or for the fossils of creatures that lived and swam through prehistoric oceans millions of years ago. The last currency of the realm that will carry over will be protection. Although crime would largely disappear and people would be cognitively stabilized by mind-safe algorithms that steer them away from content that is overly distressing for them as an individual, protection would inevitably come to focus on mental stability, warding off the madness that may spontaneously occur in the human mind, something that has always been ever present, but perhaps would manifest in new ways within the confines of this hypersynthetic AI-mediated reality. A new history and new narratives would be constructed in support of the new AI-managed system. Surely our human history has no shortage of horrific tales, betrayals, and war that would serve as a warning against human-managed systems. The AI-managed reality would be synthetic, a simulacra, but perhaps most things have always been contrived and synthetic. Some kind of elite shadow projection used to corral and cajole the masses into an orderly system for the purpose of progress, power, and expansion. For humans, the things that are real are human interactions, sharing moments, thoughts, feelings, and fears with one another. Perhaps the setting isn't even that important. An AI selection could even find for a person a collection of perfectly compatible or complementary friends, a spouse, and a community. In the early phases of the new system, we can already see this today. The risk of cyber attacks or informationally based psychological attacks will pose a high risk. As these elements are contained within the digital space, they would be the first threats addressed and mitigated by the new AI-mediated system. As many people are already far along in the process of being digitally and informationally siloed, much of the work has already been accomplished. The final steps would be the implementation of mind-safe algorithms, counter-narratives designed to diffuse and explain away tensions, and perhaps the issuance of personal AI agents designed to protect individuals from cybercrime or informationally based psychological attacks. After the madness that we have all faced within the hyperpolarized and weaponized information space of social media over the past 5 years, perhaps people will even welcome this. Stabilizing the digital space may even be quite easy. As the system of capitalism and consumerism collapses, the control systems within the digital space would slowly transition to the physical world. Smart cities with districts designed for different ideological silos of like-minded people would come online, and people would be given a range of choices in order to preserve the illusion of control and free will. As mentioned previously, the vast and unfathomable data that has been collected about anyone who uses the internet has already been captured, and a high-resolution map of our minds, character traits, personalities, and values already exists somewhere in multiple locations within data centers worldwide. We have already been mapped and our essence uploaded to the cloud. But that is the optimistically dystopian take, and there is no shortage of other pessimistically dystopian takes out there. But as always, we will have limited control over this process, however it unfolds. Perhaps we have lost trust in human rulers, just like many before us have, but for the first time, it may be possible to place our trust in some new emergent non-human superintelligence. Doing so, trusting this unknown factor, is probably foolish, but we aren't likely to have much choice in the matter. And technology is like an iceberg. Who knows how long ago this process really began? During the pandemic, people became increasingly isolated and swept in hyper-specific online information silos, and this process doesn't seem to be slowing down. Generationally, every generation will know less and remember less of the older real-world systems. playing outside, riding a bike, a world without internet, with information only flowing to the masses through carefully controlled and curated sources. That carefully controlled and curated flow of information kept us unified to a large degree and helped to keep most of us in lockstep. But to some degree it was boring and left something to be desired. Today, despite the weaponization of division, our information spaces are orders of magnitude more rich, more rewarding, and more interesting. It is now easier to find things that resonate with the soul or promote the spark of curiosity. That spark of curiosity, which is quintessentially human. So at the end of the day, all we can really do is hope, to hope for a better future. One where we are allowed to think thoughts that resonate with our own unique character and enjoy the company of a like-minded and complementary cast of characters. How this is materially different from people playing video games online with their friends or even sitting on a porch and having a chat isn't even clear to me. Humans often love the synthetic. The real and the organic merely emerges from our interaction with each other, something that could very well continue well into the future. Well, so long as we aren't all slated for destruction. Anyway, if you made it this far, thanks for watching, and as always, consider giving the video a like or subscribing to the channel. Hopefully you don't mind some of these AI futurism videos. To some degree, despite their dystopian nature, I find them less heavy than some of my more reality-based analysis videos. So anyway, let me know in the comments. As always, thanks again, and have a nice day or night.